Hi, I'm Joe Starita. I was an investigative reporter for daily newspapers for a long time, primarily in Miami, and for the last 12 years I've been Pike Professor of Journalism at the University of Nebraska College of Journalism, where I teach students, and I have written a number of books on Native Americans.
All right. The first question I wanted to ask is, what was it that led you to your interest in Native American history and stories, and specifically to write the book about Chief Standing Bear?
What you want to know? What led me to a general interest in Native Americans and the story of Standing Bear specifically? I think anybody who grows up in Nebraska, because of the large Native American footprint on this state, is exposed to it at an early age. I was exposed to it at an early age, and for whatever reason, it's something that started clicking at an early age, and it's never stopped. I love almost all things about Native American history, culture, stories, because just within the fabric of Native America there are so many good stories. There are so many good stories, and we need good stories. We have always needed good stories. We have needed good stories from the caves of Lascaux that have been carbon dated back 17,400 years through Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, Hemingway, and Louise Erdrich, an Ojibwe woman who, for my money, is the best American writer going now. We need good stories because those stories tell us who we are. If we know who we were yesterday, it helps tell us who we are today and foreshadows who we will be tomorrow. And that is something that is so powerful within the fabric of Native American culture. Stories, storytelling. So it was a natural marriage, being interested in them and being interested in telling stories. If you are interested in those things and you live in Nebraska, it's only a matter of time before, and if your frequency is tuned to those things, it's only a matter of time before your antenna will pull in the Standing Bear frequency. It's only a matter of time before you hear that story. And I had heard it in dribs and drabs, and then I just got Judy Goshkabosh, a friend of mine, the executive director of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, to sit down, promised her an hour lunch. 3.5 hours later we left, and I knew the very detailed narrative arc of the Standing Bear story, and by sundown that day I was already starting to rearrange the furniture in my life so I could go after that story with guns blazing, because it was so powerful and so wonderful, and it combined all the things that I love. Powerful characters, wonderful historical context, great themes, universal themes. I mean, when you're shopping around, deciding whether you want to spend 2.5, 3 years of your life on one specific project, when this becomes your Moby Dick, you really vet it out carefully. Does it have a protagonist? Does it have good secondary characters? Does it have a cluster of universal themes that you can braid into the narrative? And is it a powerful story? Yes, 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 and yes.
Yeah. Do you think a short discussion or short arc of the Chief Standing Bear is important at this point, or not? You want to hear it?
If you want to, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't hurt
just,
to have
just
it.
give us like a synopsis of the book, maybe, or the
Yeah.
story of the book.
Well, the short version of the Standing Bear story, the narrative arc, is, this is a story. This is a really powerful Omaha story. It's a really powerful Nebraska story. It's a really powerful American story. This is a story about a middle-aged, devoted father, chief of a small, obscure tribe tucked away in a remote corner of the northern Great Plains. And this man brought down the United States government and brought the United States federal court to its knees in his favor without ever firing a shot from his Winchester, without ever plucking an arrow from his quiver, without ever unsheathing his scalping knife. He defeated the United States government. He defeated the United States Army with a writ of habeas corpus on the second floor of a federal courtroom on the corner of 15th and Dodge Streets in the spring of 1879. By the time he walked out of that courthouse, Chief Standing Bear had accomplished something that no other Native American ever had. He sued the United States government for his freedom. All he wanted to do was bury his son. And the United States cavalry captured him when he unlawfully left the reservation in Oklahoma. They said, you're under arrest, we're sending you back. And he got the sympathy of a whole constellation of Omaha people who came out of the woodwork and started rallying around his flag. He had the most prominent lawyer in the city of Omaha, who at the time was the general counsel of Union Pacific Railroad. If you were in trouble in the spring of 1879, the one person you wanted representing you was Andrew Jackson Poppleton. And he came out and said he wanted to take the case, goes before a grizzly bear hunting, Indian hating judge, Elmer Dundee, and everybody is so moved by the humanity of this story. A people who were unethically, immorally, and illegally pushed off their land that not one but two U.S. Senate treaties said they owned, marched forcibly 550 miles to Oklahoma, where a third of the tribe died the first year we were there, including Standing Bear's son, who extracted a promise from his father, the chief, that upon his death he wanted his remains to be buried in their beloved homeland along the Niobrara River. And Standing Bear attempted to do that and got within 2 days of it, arrested by the cavalry, ends up suing for his freedom in a federal courtroom in Omaha, Nebraska, and gets it. It's a remarkable story on so many different levels, and one that I think everybody in Nebraska should be incredibly proud of, because it's just a really great American story that organically sprang from the soil of our state.
So is it fair to say that that he brought the U.S. government to its knees by telling a story? I mean, is that the power of storytelling?
Yes. And there is a transcript of what he said to the judge in the courtroom. You have to understand, what was it about this man? What was it about his story that made a judge who had never ruled favorably in Indian cases before decide for the first time in the 103-year history that this man from this point forward must be considered a human being within the meaning of the law? What is it about this man and his dignity and his courage and his rhetorical skills and his courage that would allow the highest ranking military officer west of the Mississippi, Brigadier General George Crook, to defy, of all things, a direct order from his superior? This is a heavily decorated Civil War veteran. This is a graduate of West Point. This is a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting Indians. And in March of 1879, he gets a direct order from his superior, Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan in Chicago, who had famously said years earlier, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And the highest ranking military man west of the Mississippi puts his whole career at risk by ignoring this order, and instead saddling up his horse, riding under the cover of darkness 3 miles south, and spills the story to, of all people, the local newspaper. Mm. What is it about a 52-year-old Ponca chief who didn't speak English, who could inspire a military general the ilk of George Crook to risk being court-martialed and possibly hung for defying General Sheridan's order? There's something about this man and his story and his humanity that is so universal that not even an Indian-hating judge and a career military officer could deal with. It helps really make it such a powerful story. The reaction and effect it had on others who had never ever felt that way in their life.
And next question.
Okay, let's go back and revisit some of the things we were just talking about, though. Can you talk a little bit about the involvement of religious communities in this story, in the story about the guy interviewing Standing Bear coming back? Like, let's start there and go forward.
So what role did religious institutions play in this story? And the answer to that question is they played a significant part. This religious community of Omaha was vital in terms of incubating this story and getting it off of ground zero. The primary town crier of his era was Thomas Henry Tibbles, an editor at the Daily Herald, which would soon morph into the Omaha World Herald, and he went out to interview Standing Bear one Sunday afternoon, and he was so moved by the humanity of the story, by the courage of walking that distance in that weather with no winter clothing and no food and no money, just to honor a pledge that he had made his son, that he, as a storyteller and as a writer, he couldn't wait to spread the word, to get the word of this magnificent story out. So the vehicle that he used to spread the word were the churches in Omaha, the religious community in Omaha, the temples in Omaha. In fact, he was so wound up and so jazzed up about the humanity and the Christian principles that embodied this story that he started running from Fort Omaha back to the church, a specific church in Omaha, and he was trying to jog as fast as he could because he wanted to get there before the service ended. He got there right before the service ended. They allowed him to have a few remarks, and so he told the congregation about this incredible miscarriage of justice that was occurring right down the road. He began telling the story of Standing Bear. He began planting the seed in the churches, in the religious communities, that would soon spread up and down the eastern corridor of Nebraska, but it was always, the epicenter was always in Omaha. And he began going to these churches, and sympathizers for Standing Bear began spreading the word of this very Christian man who was trying to do a very Christian thing, but this obstinate, backward-looking government wouldn't let him do it. And he thought that was outrageous. And so he appealed to the churches to help right this wrong, and they did, including Bishop Clarkson, who at that time was the most dominant and preeminent religious figure in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's just amazing. So can you talk a little bit about why this is an important moment in the civil rights movement? You know, thinking about faith and race and you know, the genesis of the civil rights movement. Is there a link between these two things?
Why would this be considered an important moment? May 1879, Omaha, Nebraska, in the arc of American civil rights and the arc of American social justice. It's a very important moment. Standing Bear went into a federal courtroom in Omaha, Nebraska, asking for something that no American Indian had really had any realistic expectation of even asking, much less getting. And don't forget, it was only roughly 20 years earlier that a black man by the name of Dred Scott had marched into a federal courtroom in Missouri asking the same thing. I want the federal court to declare me a free man. The Supreme Court famously ruled 7-2 against establishing blacks, Negroes, as free men. They denied it. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time famously wrote in his majority opinion that a Negro has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Chief Justice Roger Taney, Dred Scott. So you fast forward a mere 20 years later to the second floor of a monolithic Yellowstone courthouse on 15th and Dodge, and here is an American Indian coming into federal court asking for the same thing, asking that a federal judge in the spring of 1879 decree that he is a free man. And ultimately, Judge Dundee does exactly that. And his opinion is just beautiful. It still gives me goosebumps to read his opinion. And he decreed in the spring of 1879 that from this point forward, Standing Bear and people like him will have to be considered human beings within the meaning of the law. entitled to the same constitutional privileges as the more blessed white race. And so this is the lead domino that falls on the road to civil rights justice, citizenship rights, all of which come later. The wheels of American justice do not move that quickly. When Rosa Parks said, no, I'm not getting up from my seat on December 1st, 1955, the Civil Rights Act wasn't passed 2 weeks later. I always fantasize about what would have happened if there was even half of the media infrastructure then that exists now. I mean, if Standing Bear had a camera crew following him, if he had a whole bunch of Facebook friends, if people were sitting in the courtroom in May of 1879 tweeting to their followers, what would have happened? Well, of course, that wasn't possible, but what was possible is this very powerful story fell on the ears of very sympathetic, powerful people who made the right decision. And that decision set in motion things that would happen 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, that got Native Americans more and more equal footing at a time when they were afterthoughts at best. Mm-hmm. They were considered government property before this historic ruling. When we think about it, I mean, think about, you talk about the wheels of justice running slowly, okay, think about women. Think about the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Think about the first sentence in the second paragraph, written by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, who did that really apply to? All men are created equal is what the first graph, maybe the most famous paragraph in the Declaration of Independence. But when did the government trust women with the right to vote? Was it 1776? Was it 1796? Was it 1846? It was 1920. It took until 1920 for a paragraph that begins that all men are created equal. Well, Judge Taney didn't think that true of Dred Scott. No courtroom had ever thought that true of American Indians. No courtroom had ever thought that true of white American women. So it takes a long time for the rhetoric to catch up with the actual law. And the fact that Native Americans actually were granted full citizenship rights in 1924, it's kind of astonishing that it happened that quickly in some ways. So all these things have to be put into some kind of context, and that context is really fascinating. But there is no question that in terms of the significance of this ruling, it was such that there are many Native Americans who consider Standing Bear the Martin Luther King of Native America. And that's not widely known outside of Native America, and not even that much within Native America. But there are certainly a number of tribes who increasingly view the importance and the significance of this event and give it the social justice currency that it's due.
Can you talk a little bit about the Chief Standing Bear Trail project and what that encompasses, where you think it will be headed?
Getting down into some details about the Standing Bear Trail project, I can give you I'll give a general overview because I haven't been to all the meetings and I'm so tied up with other things. But the general view on the Standing Bear Trail, there's this fabulous marriage between a conservative white Republican congressman from Nebraska and a legendary African-American civil rights hero from Georgia, who are combining mutual interests to benefit an American Indian. So what's not to like about that story? They want to, John Lewis, African American congressman from Georgia, who is the last surviving person who spoke in August of 1963 on the I Have a Dream Day. He is the last one still standing. He wants to hook up with Jeff Fortenberry in Nebraska to get congressional muscle and money behind a project that would essentially retrace the route that Chief Standing Bear and his 750 fellow tribesmen followed when they were forcibly removed from their beloved homeland near the confluence of the Nebraska South Dakota border, the Niobrara and Missouri rivers, and forcibly marched on this almost biblical journey from hell that took 55 days, where they were unceremoniously dumped onto the Indian Territory, which in 1907 would become Oklahoma. But it was a real historic march, heroic march, and these two men are quarterbacking the team effort to try and memorialize this march, which the Ponca refer to as the Ponca Trail of Tears. The Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs is putting its muscle behind it. Union Pacific, which has large biceps, putting its muscle behind it. There is a couple of researchers that Judy Goshkabosh has employed who are, doing amazing things in pulling all of the contemporary newspapers and finding incredible down to the DNA level of where this march occurred. So, in a perfect world, the dream world is Congressman Fortenberry and Congressman Lewis are going to get congressional approval to go forward with this project, and the researchers are going to plot it out, and eventually there will be markers and high-tech methods to clue travelers and tourists and people who are just interested in, to show them exactly where Standing Bear and his people went in the spring and summer of 1877 on this march from hell to Oklahoma. And there's every reason to believe that this will be a successful venture between Congress and states and Indian people and non-Indian people, everybody rowing in the same direction for the right cause.
Wonderful. Yeah, the last question I had, we're doing reading your book, I Am a Man, Chief Standing Bear's story, as an all-church read. So we've purchased copies that are passed around within the church prior to your speaking here in November. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how story and communities sharing stories, what that does for a community to take a story like Omaha Reads or the Lincoln or the state reading objectives, like what that does for a community and for the members of a state or a city to engage in something at the same time and to talk about it. It's a bad question, but
yeah,
do what you can with it.
I think I get the drift. I mean, we're trying to explore and find out what are the communal benefits to a church or a city or a book club reading the same story. And I think the answer to that is there are many benefits. I mean, from the cliche, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. If we understand who we were yesterday, then that goes a long way in understanding who we are today. One of my favorite poets is Wendell Berry. And one of my favorite lines from Wendell Berry is, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. So think about that in terms of every single person you know. Think about the power and the arc contained in that very short, blunt sentence that goes directly to one overwhelming truth, and that is how place informs who you are, how place helps create your identity. And that was never more true according to every ethnologist in the history of the universe, than it was with Native Americans. Native Americans had relationships with the land and place in ways that have almost become over the top now. But it's true. They had relationships with the rocks and the trees and the grass and the animals in ways that we would never imagine, because we often hop from place to place and neighborhood to neighborhood. But even among a more peripatetic society, neighborhood is really the DNA here in Omaha. And if a neighborhood shares something, it pulls everybody under the tent so they get to know each other better, which has all kinds of benefits. If a church reads the same story and they isolate the universal themes that are within that story, and they understand how strong sense of place was for the Ponca, then they also instantly understand, well, of course, look at how strong my church is for my own identity. Look, if I didn't have this church, I would be a different person. If I didn't have my neighborhood and my friends in the neighborhood, I would be a different person. If I lost and had to move from Nebraska, which I love, to South Florida, which sounds like the ends of the earth, because of my husband's job, I would become a different person. So this shared history and this shared identity and this shared cultural identity that comes about when you are overlapping with the same story, or you're overlapping with the same neighborhood, it just strengthens who you are. It strengthens your identity not only individually, but it strengthens your identity as a church. It strengthens your identity as a neighborhood. It strengthens your identity as a Nebraskan. The place is created in many ways by sharing stories. What does the Bible do? Does the Bible provide any sense of identity by spreading stories?
Mm-hmm.
Do people who read the Bible, do they feel closeness with one another? Do they share a sense of identity with one another?
Mm-hmm.
Does it remove obstacles when you have stories that help inform you, that you all read and discuss and think about? Well, it's no different. It's no different than, it's the same principle. It's exactly the same principle. And that's the power of stories, and that's the power of sharing stories. It tells us who we are and who we aren't.
Well, listening to you talk about it makes me think too about it's almost a countercultural act in a society that's so fragmented by social media, where it's about my story going out into the world rather than a bringing together, sharing of a story.
Right.
You know, that may not be my story now, but when we share in other people's.
Absolutely,
you know,
absolutely. You don't even want to get me started.
I
I mean, on the fragmentation
I
of the
know,
human
I
psyche by social media,
I
and
know.
people thinking that social media is this binding element, when it is exactly the opposite. It's an isolating element. Totally. I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Like I said.
Yeah, we talk.
I agree.
You
Here,
drop
I thought
your
it was
quarter.
just about getting old.
No. I mean, well,
Not you.
Not
Me.
while we're
Yeah,
interviewing.
yeah.
Did you have other questions? I think I worked through. I guess the children's book is the only one I hadn't talked about. But did you, hearing the conversation, was there anything else? You
Oh,
wanted
no,
to-
I think it's wonderful.
Fabulous.
Covered- Yeah.
I think so.
That's fine. Thank you.
Anything else?
Oh, we're done.
That's
Good.
it?
Thank you. Thank you.